Good afternoon. My name is Dawn McKnight, and I'm the Executive Director for the Independent Association of Home Instead Franchises. On behalf of the association's Education Committee, I would like to welcome you to the next session of our webinar series, which is titled Serious Illness Conversations with Carolyn Harrison and Robert Miller. Before we get started, I just want to let everybody know if you have a question, please type that question into the chat feature and we will answer questions during the presentation if it's really relevant to that particular section, and we'll take all other questions at the end. But before I hand things over to our presenters this afternoon, I want to share a little bit of information about both of their backgrounds. Robert is a native of Wichita, Kansas. He and his husband, John, have enjoyed 20 plus years together. He completed his education at Wichita State University, including a bachelor's and master's in social work with an emphasis in medical social work. In fact, he is extremely honored to be part of the first graduating class of the then newly founded WSU Master of Social Work program in 2001. Today, he has come full circle, sharing his personal and professional experiences as a proud alumni and faculty member of WSU's College of Health Professions, Public Health Sciences Department, and Aging Program, while also consulting on the development of aging programs for the university. As well, he has started his own private care management company, CarePitch, helping clients maneuver the complexities of the healthcare system for their aging family members. And if that was not enough, at the age of 52, he plans to start the process of completing an LSCSW clinical license in social work starting this summer. Carolyn received her Bachelor of Nursing from the University of Missouri-Columbia. She received her Master of Nursing from Wichita State University and completed a certificate in clinical healthcare ethics from St. Louis University. Carolyn has a passion for patient advocacy, educating the public and healthcare professionals about healthcare choices and decisions persons need to make when they have serious illness or end-of-life decisions to make with their families. She currently is an independent nurse educator and community volunteer talking about these issues. And now I'm going to hand it over to Robert and Carolyn to begin the presentation.
So I hope everybody can hear us okay. You can hear us?
We can hear
Good.
you.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you for having us today. And Carolyn and I both have worked collaboratively for a very long time. So you're going to find us, we'll banter and we'll story tell, but we'll dive right in just because there is quite a bit of content. You should have received at this point a number of handouts, which would include a number of the advanced directives that are statutory driven for the state of Kansas. And we understand that there are a lot of people on this call that are from other states, and you're going to find some commonalities, but we can also try to address some of the differences in those questions, as well as an additional form called TPOP, which Carolyn will go into more detail here shortly, that being more of a physician-driven order sheet and not so much a legislative form, and we'll explain that. But the serious illness conversation component is not something we made up. This is something that was influenced by Dr. Atul Gawande and his organization, and we hope to really inspire you to feel comfortable to engage in these conversations with your clients. We recognize that you are people that are doing the day-to-day, very important ADL support, private duty care, and not necessarily the skilled care. So often, though, we leave it to people in the hospital to have these serious illness conversations, and yet they really should be happening at all levels of care when families are receptive and open to these conversations and before there's been a trauma. So with that said, we're going to start right in, and we like to always kind of give you a question. Think about yourself. Who would speak for you if you couldn't speak for yourself? Like if you were in a car accident tomorrow or comatose, or there was a cognitive, maybe you had delirium. Have you ever thought about who would speak for you? And this is a point in which Carolyn and I both ask important questions to our audience when we can see you and get feedback. What age should you have a advanced directive like a power of attorney for healthcare? Now, a lot of times people in the room, they'll say, oh, 65 or 55, or I don't need it until 92, right? Hey, Carolyn, what's the answer to that question?
The answer is that if you are 18 and older, so our audience is probably 18 and older, so you should think about doing this for yourself. And we'll talk about those forms that you need to have in place because we never know when an accident may happen or when we might have a stroke or those sorts of, surprise health problems in our lives.
Well, and some people would say, well, why would my 18-year-old have to even worry about this? But the reality is like I'm a product of divorce. So what happens if I'm in a car accident? I'm legally 18 and responsible for myself. My biological father has one idea, my mom has another, and I haven't specified who gets to make decisions. You can see now how in that circumstance, life gets complicated. And you start now giving the authority of those decisions to people like lawyers, judges, and doctors instead of your family. The next question we often would ask would be, have you ever had to speak for someone else about their healthcare decisions? And if you haven't, it does come with a certain sense of anxiety or responsibility. But there are some important things in considering the reward and the honor of being that individual, especially if they have determined that you are a person above all that can make decisions that they would want, not necessarily what I would want. And the best example I have of that was when my husband and I were going down the path of this, and he suggested a family member who was a healthcare professional, but not someone who was necessarily close to him. And my recommendation was, why would you pick them just because they are a nurse or whatever? No, you need to pick the person that would stand for what you would want. Like if you do not want life-sustaining measures, and you know that person would be the person to make those decisions. So those are important factors to consider.
I think too, Robert, asking this question, if you've been a caregiver to someone in your family, or if you've been a caregiver in a setting, would you have to speak for them because maybe they've shared some information? That is information you should share with persons that can put this in the chart or in the decision making so that everybody is aware what that patient wanted. So
It's so, and what we're seeing in a lot of the demographics too is that less and less is it always just an oldest child that is given these authorities. Families are thinking about all kinds of factors: geographic location, personal experience, their own self-awareness of the individual and relationship, that we even see next door neighbors or people in their own community that might become, because they may not have children. So it is not always just a biological individual. Okay. So why do we need to talk about these unpleasant topics? And they're not comfortable conversations. But what I, as a social worker, have learned, and I'm sure you as a nurse, is that the worst time to be having these conversations is when the accident or trauma has occurred. And now we're all gathering up at the ER, trying to figure out what are we going to do or who even has the authority. So it's important to keep in mind these things. If you become that individual, or you're considering being the individual that's going to assist in these choices, this is my advice. Know who you are dealing with. Make sure that you don't just know their name and the assumption of how you know them as your grandparent or parent. You need to know who they are as a human being. You need to understand what their priorities are. You need to understand what their fears are. And these are not always common conversations between family members, especially if they're an older generation. But you need to understand these things to be a good surrogate decision maker. Know what is important to them. Again, I might have my faith, I might have my sense of priority, but when I'm making a decision for someone else, I need to know what is important to them. What do they want? And even more importantly, maybe what they would not want in preventative care at this point in their life. Know who the key stakeholders are. So even though we may identify who the key decision makers are, there are always other people that are influencers or part of it. That might be a grandchild that was raised by their grandparent. That might be other siblings or people that are involved that are influencing and a part of the conversation. And we need to be aware of their presence and respect that as a part of the decision-making process. And then you got to clearly know who the decision maker is. You have to know by seeing the documents, who is the person that gets to make these decisions? Is it just the person who's in front of you, or is there a power of attorney, but they live out of Denver, Colorado? Either way, once you know that, you need to confirm their legal authorities. In most healthcare settings, I can't honor any advance directive if I don't have a copy of it. They can't just tell me that they have these items. I need to see it, because otherwise I may not know the true circumstances, and they may have even misread the document. And then make sure everybody has the same information. Very important in these circumstances. They tend to be, even preemptively, stressful conversations. Be kind and be patient for where people are at. And last thing, as much as I know or Carolyn knows, we still ask for help. Sometimes the question is more complex. Sometimes it requires some additional legal advice. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to ask for help when I need that support. Carolyn, we can go over the objectives.
Sure. We talked about what we hope that you will gain at the end of this session. And one is just to recognize your own struggles, maybe about talking about end of life care, or a serious illness conversation you need to have with a family member. I think, as I've learned over the years, the more practice I have, the need to do it is making it possible for me to learn the skill. So don't worry if you don't catch this today and know how to do it, just keep practicing. And also to recognize patients who could benefit from these serious illness conversations. For example, even now, I think about former President Carter. He is someone that probably could benefit or has benefited from a serious illness conversation. He's made decisions to go into hospice. So I would assume that, he's a person that really has had these conversations with his family. So start the conversations, because it really does help. I'll give you in a few minutes some of the advantages, but what would lead to goals of care. And also, most importantly, too, to document these conversations with advanced directives and or TPOP, and I'll talk more about that. That is an acronym for Transportable Physician Orders for Patient Preferences. And you might live in a part of the country that uses MOST, M-O-S-T, medical orders for sustaining treatments, or it might be PULSE, which I'll show you an example of that too. And TPOP is just a paradigm of that. It looks very similar, and it has been approved by the PULSE upper echelon. So,
well, if there's anything we both can definitely agree on, the conversations matter, but you have to have something written down. The forms themselves aren't, you can't have one without the other. Conversation and writing down these directives.
And I think certainly we all have probably experienced maybe some serious illnesses in our practice with our patients, or maybe in family and caring for adults. And so we'll talk about maybe some of these that are common types of serious illness. And I made a list. I don't want any of these, but we probably will all experience maybe something on this list, but cancers, brain, pancreatic, kidney, et cetera, dementias, Alzheimer's, and there's many other kinds of dementia, stroke, or other neurological diseases. I have a good friend whose spouse just had a mini stroke, PSA, and she is 32 years old. So this type of serious illness may be something she needs to be aware of as she, ages, but she's quite young to have a stroke. So it can happen at many different ages. Cirrhosis or ascites would be one of the symptoms when someone has liver disease. COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Those who have difficulty breathing, even now with allergies and that's not COPD, but I know that they are having some problems in breathing. And if they smoke, then it's really compounding the trouble. So that might be a type of serious illness, or heart disease. And there could be many situations under that with maybe AFib, or you've had congestive heart failure and end-stage renal disease. I have taken care of patients in the past with that, and they certainly do need to have this serious illness conversation. So We also, as professionals in healthcare, can look at some of the trajectories of dying. This is really something that we've learned with research, but also that in our experience, if somebody has obviously a sudden death, that's sudden. We don't have time many times to have these conversations, but I would say if you're 18 and older, we should start talking. And then another trajectory would be a terminal illness. I had a sister who just passed last year from pancreatic. And so from diagnosis to her death was 9 months. So that was not a long time to make plans or have goals of care that changed, but there was lots of conversation during that time with family and friends. Perhaps organ failure. I see this trajectory oftentimes with COPD. They go back in the hospital, they have pneumonia. Maybe the next time they're on a ventilator for a short period of time, they're weaned off. But what about the next time? What will happen? Or kidney disease. We just know that there's hospitalizations that occur with some of these illnesses. Frailty. I have a 93-year-old aunt that just, she's very sharp in her memory and conversation, but physically she is becoming very, very frail. So I worry about her, and I know, and she knows that death is imminent, but when that will be, and certainly if I ask the surprise question, I would say I would not be surprised if she died in the next year because she has become so frail. So these are what we call trajectories of dying. And we also, Robert and I have taught a lot of people how to have these conversations, but even physicians avoid these conversations with their patients.
Carolyn, you once told me, and I loved this saying, we have to remember that physicians are human too.
Right.
So as much as we may have expectations that physicians should be the ones to be more forthright in guiding those, if they've had a long-term relationship with their client, it's not easy for them either. And so families and clients need to equally be a part of that relationship to bring the conversation up so that a physician also knows that you are comfortable talking about it sooner than later versus just when the trauma happens.
And certainly some physicians are better at it than others. It
They
might
are.
be with their subspecialty, or they just have the opportunity, I should say, to practice this more. And so they become more comfortable. But this is a cartoon that Robert found, and I truly believe this is appropriate. There's no easy way I can tell you this, so I'm sending you to someone who can.
Which happens, and it's a reality, the comedy here, and that it's like a primary care practitioner might have an assumption, oh, I see some dementia, but I'm going to send you off to the neurologist or neuropsychologist to really say the words. And we see this pretty commonly. But it is important still to make sure that we, as advocates for ourselves, generate these conversations no matter who the practitioner is in front of us.
And I'm going to tie this cartoon into a later question that we can ask on our conversation, because then you can find out more about what the patient's information is.
So part of the inspiration of this, of course, this term serious illness conversation came from Dr. Atul Gawande and a book you wrote about being mortal. And this is we're going to show a short 5-minute version. You should be able to hear the audio of him discussing why this project was so important from a physician's point of view, which really encapsulates what all of us here in the room as professionals do. So
one of the reasons I write is it gives me my chance to dive into problems that I'm very confused about. I've written about, what are we supposed to do about the cost of healthcare? Why is the malpractice system so crazy, and what's the way it should be? I've written about why do we itch? If it's confusing and interesting to me, writing is my way of diving in and figuring out what to at least think about it. And this was one of the big ones. The two big unfixables are aging and dying. You can't fix those. We're afraid of talking to the patient about these problems as well. A lot of doctors feel like, I know how to have this conversation. I know exactly what I'm doing. But what I could see over and over again was that we weren't particularly good at handling people going through the last phase of their life. I've had to learn that because of patients with whom, they did not end up with a good experience at all. And then I've had to learn it the hard way because of my dad.
Do you remember when Dad first started to get pain in his neck?
He thought either playing too much tennis or just muscle.
And instead what they found was a tumor, a huge tumor.
I remember I took notes in my journal around that time. This is my dad saying, the way things are going, I could be bedridden in a few months.
The tumor had extended into his midbrain. The suggestion was that we should go see what options there might be for chemotherapy. So the oncologist lays out 8 or 9 different options, and we're swimming in all of it. Temozolomide, vincristine, vinblastine. And my dad says, well, what if I don't take any? And she said, well, that's your choice. Then started talking about how, you really should think about taking the chemotherapy. Who knows? You could be playing tennis by the end of the summer. I mean, that was crazy. It made me very bad because it was,
Completely not right, yeah.
This guy's potentially within weeks of being paralyzed. It was holding out a hope that was not a realistic hope in order to get him to take the chemotherapy.
When he made the final decision that he doesn't, want to, I told him, for me, it's okay if you're paralyzed, so what? I can take care of you. Yeah. And that's the main difference. It was not fine for him.
The oncologist was being totally human, and the oncologist was talking to my dad the way that I have been talking to my patients for 10 years. But hope is not a plan. And in fact, we find from our trials that we are literally inflicting therapies on people that shorten their lives and increase their suffering out of an inability to come to good decisions.
So as you can see, this is a documentary, the full, is it like an hour, hour and a half?
There's segments of it, Robert, but the full documentary is 57 minutes. I think.
It's so worth seeing. It's a great tool, not only for people that are in the conversation, it's a great training tool at the perspectives, even though it may be looking at it from an acute level of care. When we talk about the real fears that people have at home that are exploring this, through the documentary, he speaks to a number of families, and there's some very courageous conversations, even with grandchildren, that are exhibited. So I would highly recommend you check out the book, Being Mortal, as well as for yourself, watch the full documentary. You can get it, I think, on YouTube for free, and just consider that something and see how it applies to your practice.
I mentioned earlier the surprise question, and if you Google the surprise question, you will find several sources, but it's really from Sinai Hospital in New York that has done a wonderful research about this. But so the question is, would you be surprised if this person were to die in the next year? So for example, let's just use former President Carter. Would you be surprised if President Carter died in the next year? I would assume you would say no, because we've seen some in the public media about how his illness and that he's facing his end of life. So if the answer is no, then it's time for the conversation. So it might be even if suddenly somebody receives a prognosis of a terminal illness and they would only live for a few months, then would you be surprised? The answer is probably no. So again, you might have that conversation. So the surprise question is being used by physicians in many medical circles. I've heard several cardiologists speak to this question. And there's research that shows it's not the same as saying you have a prognosis of a year or less, which may help in terms of putting people on hospice or, helping people to plan their lives for the next year. Also for cancer and renal patients, this surprise question does a much better job for predicting mortality than current Medicare hospice certification, which I think is really very valuable. So look at that in terms of a question that you can be using with your patients. And then also recognizing the trajectory of illness can help plan care. physicians and nurses and other healthcare professionals know with certain illnesses, we know that trajectory. So we need to help our patients too plan their lives because they can live till the end. We need to help plan their healthcare and also their living during that time.
And I think that you might think again, if home instead and we're non-skilled services and we're not involved, but you can see the relevance of even you during your evaluation with a family about a loved one that you're going to be providing some form of care if it's advancing, especially to be able to ask that question, would you be surprised? Because it can really guide you if you are also helping them connect to other resources. Wow, they don't have hospice. Maybe we should help them make that connection. So this question is a really beautiful way, even for your agencies, to get a good answer from the family, what they understand.
So there are also some other evidence that demonstrates that this conversation can improve outcomes. For example, and I would assume this helped my sister when we had more and more conversations, it did lower her anxiety and depression at the end of life because she knew she had a plan and her family was in agreement with it and they were informed. And also it results in us having more skill and better prepared workforce to take care of the patients. And it's associated, interestingly, with lower costs of care at the end of life. I can't remember the exact percentage, but most Medicare dollars are spent in the last 6 weeks of life. And so this may be something Medicare should really be encouraging, is that we all have this serious illness conversation, as we age. So this is the guide. I sent this to Michael, and it should be something that you can also Google, Serious Illness Conversation Guide, if you didn't get the attachment. But this is really important. When I started using this a number of years ago, and it was produced by Dr. Atul Gawande at Ariadne Labs. Now, that's not a lab that is, medical information per se. It's research that they've done. It's kind of a think tank. So they give you very interesting steps that really help. And I practice this with patients and families, my own family. And I'm going to point out a few questions that I thought were very helpful in the conversation flow. For example, the question, what is your understanding now? That's in the second section there. So when somebody is maybe just coming into your care, this is a great question to ask. Well, what do you know about your illness, or what is your understanding now of where you are? I've been through chemo, radiation, and I'm doing this, or I don't know. I don't have cancer, and then you look at their chart and they do have cancer. So you really clear up a lot of misinformation sometimes with this. But also, I thought this was interesting. My sister's oncologist asked this same question: how much information would you like to have with your illness you want from me? And that was so helpful to her. It opened up the door to conversation. And also she asked the question later, tell me what your plans are. There was just an open door right away with her oncologist, which I appreciated greatly. But we really need to also share the prognosis. So this would be something the physician could say, or I want to share with you my understanding of where things are with your illness. It might be a palliative care specialist. But here's a framing that I thought was helpful too. It can be difficult to predict what will happen with your illness. I mean, each patient is different, but I hope you will continue to live well for a long time. But I'm worried that you could get sick quickly. I use this same phrase with my sister and patients. It's just amazing how it helps open the conversation too. And I always used to say, I'm sorry you're ill, or I'm sorry we're in this situation. And I like the way this was phrased with sharing the prognosis, but I wish we were not in this situation. You're not leaving the patient alone, but I'm worried that time may be short. And that's another thing that I think physicians can really say. We don't, we can't be specific, but probably, like my sister's oncologist said, 9 months. He also said to her, most patients don't ask.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting that
They don't want to know.
They don't want to know, but my sister said, well, I do want to know. And then they were very open to more conversation about that. But
And don't you think this is where what I love about this tool for anybody, if it's you to your own family member, these are great tips. If it's professional to a family member or whatever, this is a more empowering, authentic, empathetic way of approaching the conversation versus based on assumptions. Oh, so your chart says you have cancer, and the person is like in denial and now is in shock. Versus that, tell me more about what you understand about your condition. So it gives us as a professional a real leveling tool to then go back to other professionals in the interdisciplinary team or resources and say, I'm not sure she understands, or maybe that's her choice, but we should all be aware she did not reiterate the same thing that Dr. Smith has told me about her condition.
Yeah.
And that's really important in the process of keeping the client autonomous and involved in their care to the level that they're specifying, as well as their family.
And Robert, I want to point out on this slide, you'll notice there's some bold highlights on some of the words here. And in this research of this conversation, they found that these were the words the patients remembered you saying. So I thought that was very interesting, using the words hope you will continue to live well for a long time, or I'm worried, I wish we were not in this situation. That those are key words that people remember. So again, Robert said, be kind, and this has been tested, so we should use this serious illness conversation. But again, the paper is just, it's important.
It's a piece of paper.
Right, but it's a piece of paper, but the conversation is the goal. But then in order to communicate with the rest of your team, you really need to document the conversation. And hopefully with TPOP and Pulse, those sorts of forms, that helps a great deal to find it much easier. Also, there are examples of advanced directives that are statute driven for every state in the United States. Since 1992, the federal government has stated that every state has its own statutory language that governs these types of documents. And so they're very similar, but legislative leaders wrote the words in their particular state. You can go to, at the end, there's some resources, and the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization has them for every state in the United States.
And it's not advanced.
No,
This
it's
is Carolyn.
without a
Carolyn
D.
corrects me. Yes, it's advanced directives. We often see it spelled advanced with a D. It is not. And the other thing is we must remember that this is a very specific set of directives, does not necessarily include all of the legal papers that someone may still choose to put in place. So for example, power of attorney for financial arrangements would not be considered an advanced directive like a power of attorney for healthcare decision-making, which we're going to review now. So
The first one, and this is going to be a form that's in the state of Kansas, and it's published.
and you have copies of these.
Yes, and it's at actually every hospital, acute care setting in the United States. So if you have a little neighborhood community hospital, they should have these forms because they're mandated by the federal government to hand these to patients on admission. And there might be someone in particular at home instead at each setting that takes this to the patient's family and makes sure that it's completed, or they have a copy in your file, because this is it's by statute, and only while the patient has capacity can they fill one of these out. I couldn't fill it out for my aunt who had dementia. Once they have lost capacity, that this is a form that you cannot fill out for someone else. It has to be filled out for the patient. So oftentimes, as you may know, we end up pursuing guardianship for our patients and residents in.
When they're beyond the ability to sign this form.
Correct.
And something to keep in mind, we debate this often. Carolyn and I work with an ethics conference here in Kansas, in the Wichita area. But one of the things that we often will debate is that term capacity versus competency. We're not going to go deep into that today, but it is important for you to vet that with the resources in your area. Capacity is a medical term. Competency is a legal term. And so oftentimes I'll hear people say they're not competent to sign this form. That typically to me would mean that a judge or a legal system has made a determination about competency that would say that they can or cannot have that right. Most of the things that Carolyn and I will work within is a capacity, which means someone might have a diagnosis that is compromising some of their abilities, but if they show the capacity to answer questions correctly or even consistently, this form could still be signed by that person if that's their choice.
Right.
Did I say that right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
One of the ways that I did some exams of the patient or a mental test. But one thing you can understand is that you might tell them what's for breakfast and they get to choose. Or you might, with these forms, explain what it's for and then tell them to, tell me now, what did you think this form was for? And if they're way off base or they don't understand, maybe it's too complicated. Sometimes that's patients really, as they age, they don't want to hear all this information. And so they defer to maybe a family member or someone. But this really does need to have the capacity of the individual, the patient.
And we're going to reiterate again with anything that is a directive, which is a legal term, the 3 forms you're about to see can only be signed by the patient, the client. Their daughter cannot step in and put a power of attorney for healthcare in place on this form and sign it for her mother. That would not be legal. So that's why it's important that they show that capacity to sign it for themselves.
Correct. Very important, Robert. I'm going to go to the next slide and then come back to the DNR because the living will declaration ties in. This again is a statute, but it's in addition to the durable power of attorney for healthcare. This is actually saying very specifically that if if your dying shall not be, you don't want your dying to be artificially prolonged. But every time I spoke to patients about this, I would say, tell me what you think artificially prolonged means. Because sometimes they think, well, it just means no CPR. Well, that's what the DNR is for, is if you just want to stop cardiac respiratory resuscitation. So in this is really talking about, notice the title in Kansas, underneath it says Kansas Natural Death Act. That kind of leads you to understand that this means I want to die naturally, but the wording is very specific. But patients need to understand what they're signing with this. Notice there's no other place to add a name to make the decision. You've already done that with the DPOA for healthcare. This one is only signed by the patient. And so let's say they did this and then had it notarized or witnessed by 2 people, and they cannot be people that would be benefiting from the will or from, they can't be family members. So it's a notary or 2 witnesses. So I say, go to your next door neighbor. They're not going to benefit from your will. Probably. Yeah. So go to, or just go to the bank. Usually banks will do your notary, or in Wichita, we have the Wichita Medical Research Education Foundation that will do it. So one sentence or phrase I really want to stress in this is that I understand the very last paragraph, the full import of this declaration, and I'm competent to make these decisions. So if you've made one before, this one would revoke it. But let's say the date is today's date, and you did the 10 years from now, you want to redo the the DPOA for healthcare because maybe your agent's passed or they no longer are interested in being your agent. You could still have a living will from 10 years ago. This does not expire at all. So
make sure you read through these because this is where the state can slightly alter things. In our state, it does specify that 2 physicians must determine that my condition is non-curable, and that typically one of those people is my primary care practitioner. That may or may not be the same in different states. I would assume it is, but you do want to make sure you're familiar with the logistics of the form. Carolyn and I both also agree we would never sign a living will declaration on its own without a power of attorney for healthcare. Because only signing this form means you really are putting the authority into the hands of 2 physicians, versus if my power of attorney for healthcare is also appointed, they can give some direction or context to the terms of a living will based on what I want for myself. So that's our typical recommendation is don't just do a living will, make sure you do both.
And just as an added information, how I learned more about living will was that I asked physicians, how do you interpret this? Because sometimes physicians are a little wary about this, but I think it is something that, again, conversation that came along with the paper is what will lead you, in addition to the form and who gets to decide, the DPOA. Now, the last advanced directive form is the DNR, do not resuscitate directive. Notice it says directive. Again, as Robert mentioned, only the patient signs this. It's not valid until the physician signs it. And I know in many states now, nurses or PAs can sign, and then they have their physician that oversees their care signs it. That's something you need to find out specifically from your state and your facility that you work in. Or how Home Instead handles this. So in the state of Kansas, oftentimes we give this to somebody who says, well, my mom needs a DNR. That's what the doctor said. So, okay, is she or he, your relative, able to sign this? And then it should be signed only in front of the physician. Okay, because sometimes people think, oh, my sister signed it for her or signed it for mom, and we don't want that to happen. So do it in front of the physician. And then it can be revoked. It's all automatically revoked if the patient's going to surgery. Oh,
Yeah, and the importance again of this form is that this is where someone really doesn't want those heroic measures of intubation or chest compressions. It's important that they understand, because sometimes people don't want those things, but they're afraid the DNR means do not feed me, do not give me medications. Those are a whole slew of other reasons. This is purely those heroic measures. I will say, to Carolyn's point of signing it in front of a physician, when I worked for a hospice agency, obviously that isn't always as easy to do. So, but those physicians were aware that we were coaching, the social work was involved, the family was present, the client signs the document, and then we sent the form to physicians. But they were clearly aware that this wasn't going to blindside them. So it isn't a requirement that it has to be signed in front of a physician. It's a preference. And there are some circumstances where, like with other professionals involved, the physician trusts, they know where this is coming from. Would you agree?
yes, absolutely. And I think I was just thinking, if I were a Home Instead employee and I was entering a home to take care of a patient, I would want to know, do they have any of these advanced directives and where are
Absolutely.
they? It just made me remind myself that that's something you should always ask, because if the DNR is in a file somewhere and they, their heart stops, you need to present this to EMS or they will continue resuscitation.
I mean, if these conversations are happening, these documents should not be in a safety deposit box. The original can be stored, but copies can be made and will be honored by most agencies. So as Carolyn says, in our state, or at least our city and county, we promote, put them on the refrigerator, or we have a Vial of Life system that the EMS providers use. You may have different programs in your area, but having these secret documents, families need to be empowered to ask mom and dad, I need a copy of the document so I have it so I can help you.
Okay, we're going to talk about just briefly, and Robert mentioned this already, that there are other legal documents that people use, like the DPOA of finance and trust documents, that maybe you go to an attorney and they do the whole package with the DPOA for healthcare and the living will and DNR and the DPOA for finance. But these are very important that you don't have to take these to the hospital. They are not healthcare documents. They're not related to your healthcare. You don't need to add those. So if you've gone to an attorney and you have the whole package, that's fine. But again, I think we need to mention that always advanced directives are free at every hospital. You can ask your physician, you can Google it. Usually the NHPCO, the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, you can just print off those documents in your state.
And we do have a list of references and links at the end of the presentation that you can utilize. Just keep in mind, though, when you're speaking to a family and you say, hi, do you know if you have a power of attorney for healthcare and a living will? They'll go, oh, yeah, I have a will. They're not understanding. You really want to look at those documents to make sure you know, because the assumption that they have a will, thinking it's their medical directives, can lead them down a path of suddenly not having anything they need when to really do challenge when you're doing your evaluations, that these are the right documents and they're understanding the terms, because we don't want them to not have them when they need them.
Right. We're going to go into a little detail about some of these different physician order sheets that are different from advanced directives. So the other living will, durable power of attorney for healthcare, and the DNR are statute-based, and these are doctor's orders. They are considered a standard of care. So across the US, they might have a little different acronym, but these are similar, very, very similar. The TPOP, transportable physician orders for patient preferences, medical orders for sustaining treatment, and the physician orders for life-sustaining treatment are all very similar. The TPOP was really developed by the Center for Practical Bioethics in Kansas City for Kansas and Missouri only. If you go to their website, you can get a guidebook for the latest TPOP form, and it's an educational brochure, excellent, and I would suggest that you did it. We did not create this. It was created by the Center for Practical Bioethics and a physician team of and a physician and other team members developed the TPOP form. So I'm going to just show this, but I asked or sent it to Michael too to give it to you. But this is for educational purposes only. We don't give this out. We give them to like the palliative care nurses, the doctor's offices, physicians in the trauma unit, just so that they fill them out. The Center for Practical Bioethics wants patients to understand this with the help of a physician. And one of the nice things that I feel it really helps provide for us is that if the patient no longer has capacity or legal competency, then you can discuss this with the patient representative, the DPOA, and they can actually sign this. And it is an order form that the physician will cover on A, B, C, the different elements of this, like CPR, treatment orders with full treatment and there's a lot of information on this sheet, but this, I think, benefits so much. It documents the conversation, and now Medicare does have a code that they pay if you have these conversations and document them in the patient's chart. So that's a benefit too.
And Carolyn, wouldn't you say part of the reason people would say, well, if we have advanced directives, why do we need a physician order sheet? But the reality is advanced directives are really kind of all or nothing in most cases. Outside of that durable power of attorney for healthcare, where that person has a lot of leverage to make a variety of decisions, there still isn't any guidance in that document as to what they can, should, or may need to do. That comes from the conversation you have with your own mother. This is a great tool that allows the patient to be able to have a conversation with their practitioner or their team, their care team, if that be the social worker, the hospice case manager, whatever, to say, I'd like to be a little more clear for my power of attorney or for my professionals, the things I do and don't want. It gets out of the black and white and more into the details that sometimes can be really scary. Like, I still want artificial nutrition, or I still want certain things, but if my heart stops, I want to go ahead and be a DNR. And sometimes those things are treated as one thing, but they are not mutually exclusive to each other. And we use these in the healthcare industry, we would call them standing orders. That idea that a physician is pre-writing a set of orders and signing them to say that when this happens, give aspirin. Or in this case, when this happens, do or do not do this per the preference of the client. This is a powerful tool. We're still really doing a lot of education because it's not a legal form. It sometimes gets misconstrued, but it is so important when your physician has this conversation. And this doesn't necessarily mean you're dying tomorrow to be able to have this conversation. You could have newly diagnosed with cancer. You see the severity of the circumstance. You're not sure what could happen, but if this did, I would prefer these things were the choices in my care. Am I right?
Right. Yeah. The form that you should have is updated. I think since this one that's on the this one, I think it says 2021, 22. It was updated, so you'll see. Just a quick example is on A. It's the very first choice that the patient has is do not attempt resuscitation. So we start with that, and then talking about CPR and that sort of thing. So anyway,
A second here, Carolyn, because
Yeah.
for some reason,
yeah.
it doesn't want to go past that slide.
Oh, okay.
Okay, there we go. So setting the stage for the conversation, part of the reason we presented, and we're into our last 10 minutes here, which is perfect, but was I was involved through Wichita State University on a project called the Big Read, which is an NEA, National Endowment for the Arts program, in which they selected a book called Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant by Roz Chast. It really sparked this last summer conversation in the general community, not only just about what the conversation of serious illness and the directives and paperwork, but in general, what it looked like from a family's perspective, the stress that came when you weren't necessarily either having those conversations or your parents weren't always willing participants. So we wanted to just take a minute to share with you some excerpt, about 3 minutes from Roz, about why she wrote this book. We would recommend that this is a great tool for kicking off conversations with families that is less about the medical perspective and more about the family perspective.
Hi, my name is Roz Chast. I'm the author of Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? I'm excited that my book is part of the 2022-23 NEA Big Read. This is a book that I wrote about my parents, and specifically about the last 10 years or so of their lives and my experience with taking care of them. And I was an only child. So the taking care of two elderly people, they were in their 90s, it pretty much fell to me. I have to say that one of the reasons I wrote it was because the experience was extremely surprising to me. This was a part of life that was so little talked about. On any level, I really had no idea what to expect, what services were out there, what other people had gone through. I had many emotions during the experience, some happy, some not so happy, a lot of frustration, a lot of sadness. Sometimes things were funny. And I'm a cartoonist, so I guess I tend to look at things from a certain point of view. The book it's a graphic memoir. So it is told in the form of comics, but it's not completely that. There are some pages that are comics. There are some pages that are just writing. There's sort of, I guess, a scrapbooky aspect to it. I wrote it, it sort of unfolded in the way that it had to unfold as I was putting it together. I had a vague idea of how it would, I knew what the arc of the story was. Although actually, as I started writing it, one thing that happened was that I realized I wanted to put it more in context. So I needed to write a little bit about my relationship with them, which I think has a lot to do with how the experience of taking care of them as two elderly people went. And when I say elderly, I mean that my father died at 95, my mother died at 97. And the last few years were certainly much more drawn out and painful and complicated. And I know how horrible this is going to sound, but also expensive and strange, just surreal. The experience was. So, I mean, in many ways, it felt when I was going through it, a very isolating experience. I think because when I went through it, my parents were a lot older when they had me, and nobody I knew had gone through what I was going through. I was living in Connecticut and my parents were living in Brooklyn. And so we were not exactly neighbors. And I also had two small children at home. So it was a complicated experience from which I learned a lot. And I hope other people find it interesting.
So as you can see, oops, let me get out of that. Get past that. Okay. And so as you can see, we found value in this book because it really personalizes the conversation. We don't want everyone to think that this has to be an overtly traumatic experience. And it doesn't mean that you have to talk about serious illness like every 6 months, but it puts it in context to the relevancy that we as professionals need to create safe place and language to help families have these conversations before really traumatic circumstances come into play. And if you pick up Roz's book, which I would encourage you do for your own kind of self-awareness, it's a great cultural tool as to the experience of a family member, an only child. Her parents were Jewish, pretty traditional Jewish. They had lived through World War II. They understood what it looked like. And it had really, as I mentioned in the first slides, you got to know who you're dealing with. The daughter didn't necessarily know all of those things and what she was dealing with, that it led itself to a lot of personal challenges. She gets to the end of the road. She celebrates it in the book, but it is a great example of why we should have these conversations with our loved ones sooner than later. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. I just had a consult the other day with a family who's making decisions, and the parent is just been diagnosed with a terminal illness, but no paperwork has been done, no will is in place, and there's lots of complications with just decision making. So Roz Chast's book really talks about that too, the relationship with the parents and trying to discuss end of life care, but also what do we do with all this stuff, and how do we, make the end of your life comfortable and
Right.
understand where you are.
Put the control back into your hands is what you want. And I'll agree with you. I'll echo as a last statement. I took a client, I do private case management. They were very clear. Oh, yes. We're DNRs and we have the forms and they're on the fridge. And if you don't say, hey, can I just take a look at those? I took a look at them. They had signed the form, but the physician had not, because they didn't understand that the physician had to sign it, which means that when EMS would show up and they don't have a physician's order, they really aren't obligated to follow that directive. So it is so important not only to look at this once, but review it. For me and my last living grandmother, every year on her birthday was the day. We and not to make it grim, but we would visit with the lawyer about any estate issues. We'd talk about the goals for the next year, and then we'd go out to dinner. And I think it's just important that we build this in a non-threatening way into the traditions of our family. You have pages of resources that we have included. We hope you find those valuable. They do include link to websites. And it's up to you guys. We're willing to stay a little long, but it's just now 2:00, so we can take questions.
Yeah, thanks both Robert and Carolyn. That was fantastic. I mean, I learned a lot from, I have an aging mother. I think she has some things in place, but not everything's in place, but I have nothing in place. So it's good to know that you really can't start too early, right? I have 3 adult children, and I would hate to have them have to make these decisions and worry about that. So I can really see the importance of kind of taking the burden off of your family. And there can be a good way to do it, right? Like you described, it doesn't have to be grim. I mean, it should be a family conversation. I mean, and you can, I'm sure there's in ways we can do it in a way to, celebrate life as opposed to just thinking about the end. But I agree with taking control. That's so important, I think, for anybody who's going through that end of life stage. They want to feel in control because maybe they've lost control in a lot of other ways. They're not driving anymore, or somebody else is taking care of their finances for them. And so, yeah, it was fantastic. I don't have any questions. And the only reason I can think that is because you were so thorough and there's so many handouts that everybody can refer to. So yeah, it was fantastic. I'm sure everybody, we have one. We ask about POA and proxies at new client assessments, but don't collect or scan any forms. It certainly makes sense to do so. Okay, so it's more of a comment.
And I know at least for Kansas, and I know Michael Steinberg, I don't know what their practices are here in Wichita, or for any agency that I've worked at, if I have a responsibility to a client, I ask and I inform them, in order for me to honor your advanced directives, I must have a copy on file. And that's pretty common. For example, if there was an accident, how would I know that I could call this daughter and have permission to disclose information? You know, it's very easy to get in trouble quickly, even with something just like that. So I would say you should have a copy of their advanced directives if you are also collecting any other information to provide them services.
Yeah, that's great recommendation. Well, fantastic. So if there are any follow-up like questions, is it okay for people to send you an email and ask
Absolutely.
anything? Okay. So
Absolutely.
I mean, I can share that information with them, with the attendees. I can share your just your email addresses if that's okay as a
Yeah,
follow-up.
That's right.
Okay.
well, thank you for letting us join
Thank
you.
Don.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we appreciate all the preparation you put into it, the time that you spent. It was having a great spending the past hour with you, and I want to thank all the attendees for taking their time out of today. And I just hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
You too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.